Hello, and welcome to this North Green video about desktop breakout. Today we're going to talk about some different techniques that can be used to escape restrictions that are stopping you from being able to run different commands and applications that you may want to run on a locked down environment like a desktop or a kiosk. So within penetration testing, there can typically be exercises where you are provided a corporate laptop or desktop, and one of the first things you need to do is try and break out of the restrictions. Typically, at this point, what we're aiming to do is gain access to something like the command prompt or PowerShell to start with, as this gives us an ability to have some kind of interactive capability of running commands and starting to enumerate information about the environment. So let's have a look at what we might do when trying to break out of desktop restrictions. So first of all, what we would typically try and do when connecting to a computer would be to simply try and open the command prompt. And we can see here that this has been disabled and we cannot open it. We may choose to try and open PowerShell instead. And we can see that this is just refusing to open as well. So what we can try and do to get around this kind of restriction is we can try and see whether or not we've got any ability to just run a command anyway. So we may not be able to open the command prompt, but if we come down here and type CMD for the command prompt and K, this is going to give us an ability to submit a command anyway. So it's going to run the command ipconfig. And we can see that this executes absolutely fine. But then we get the message, this is disabled by your administrator. You do not have interactive access. So we can run this again and do something like, who am I? And we can see again, we get our output. We are the user breakout one, but we don't have interactive access. So this can be helpful to give us some level of information, some ability to enumerate details about our environment, but realistically, we're keen to try and have something that's a bit more interactive. So if we know the command prompt will execute a command for us, what we can try and do is we can turn around and say, well, actually, what happens if we try and run the command PowerShell? So we're not loading PowerShell itself. What we're doing is we're loading up command prompt, the cmd.exe, and we're telling it to elevate its capability to PowerShell. And we can see here we get this PS to show that this command prompt is now actually a PowerShell interface. So what's happened here is that we've been able to tell the machine, hey, I might not be allowed to run command prompt, but if you can run commands for me, then I want you to run the command PowerShell. And again, that's not us as the user running PowerShell. We've managed to circumvent the request so that it's coming from a process running on the machine itself. So it now thinks that we can run PowerShell absolutely fine because it's a process requesting PowerShell, not a user. And you can see that now I have nice interactive capabilities to run whatever kind of command that I want. And this would give me the ability to try and enumerate some information about the environment to see whether or not I can figure out where I am on a network, for example. So that's one way that we can try and circumvent these protections. Now we're going to try and go back to seeing if there's any other alternative way to get to PowerShell. Maybe that wouldn't work in an environment you find yourselves in. Maybe system administrators would have been clever enough to stop that. So what we're going to do is see whether or not there's an alternative way to be able to turn around and get that PowerShell executable open. Now we know that if we try and go to PowerShell, I can double click all I want and it won't open. I can double click every option and nothing's happening. And we're not quite sure what's being used or what process they've used to block this or filter this. But what I can try and think of is maybe they're blocking it by putting it on a blacklist of saying, you know what, no user is allowed to be able to run PowerShell.exe. So to try and circumvent that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply go to where the executable PowerShell.exe is, and I'm going to see whether or not I can take it and get a way of circumventing this list denying me from being able to access it. So PowerShell is located in C, Windows, System32, and then Windows PowerShell. Okay, we got version 1, and we can see we have the executable here. If I double click, it is again restricted. I'm not able to open PowerShell. But one thing that I might think about is maybe it's just being blocked because it's PowerShell. So if I copy this, just going to throw this on my desktop for the minute. And once more, this is blocked. I can't do anything with it. But what I can try and test is whether or not there are other named executables that I am allowed to open. And I can simply change this copy of PowerShell to be called something different. So one thing that exists on pretty much every Windows machine is a calculator. So I'm just going to rename this PowerShell to calc. And if I double click this now, then we've been able to load up PowerShell. This is still a PowerShell interface. Even though it's called calc.exe now, what has happened is we have been able to circumvent that blacklist saying, do not let a user run PowerShell.exe. And instead, we've taken that executable and called it something different, called it something that typically system administrators would not think to block. So this is our way of being able to circumvent that blacklist. Next, we're going to have a look at how we can try and use scheduled tasks to be able to trigger executables. So I'm just going to change from this user account to a different one. Just going to log into the user breakout 2. Now this user has very similar restrictions. They can't open particular files. They can't open PowerShell. They can't gain any access to a shell that will allow them to enumerate an environment, that will allow them to be able to do some useful work as a penetration tester. And we're going to figure out, can we still gain access to that PowerShell executable? We can see that once more, we cannot load up PowerShell. I can double click all I want, nothing is happening. Now we can take a similar approach to getting a process like command prompt to load up PowerShell, and we can use the task scheduler. Now what we can do is we can turn around and say, okay, I as a user am not allowed to open up PowerShell. But what happens if I get a process to open PowerShell? I can have a look at the task scheduler. What I can do with this is I can turn around and say, I want this as a function of the operating system to be able to do something useful to me. So what I'm going to do is just say that I want to create a really basic task. And what my goal is here is to be able to turn around and say, I'm going to create a task so that when I log on, the computer is going to trigger PowerShell, not me, the user. It's going to call this breakout. Go next. And we're going to trigger this when I log on. We can see our action here. We've got a choice of actions. I'm going to say I want to start a program, and I want to start PowerShell.exe. So now what I've got is a task that will run when I log in. So now all I have to do is simply log out and log back in to test whether or not it's going to work. I'm just going to simply sign out. And then we're going to sign back in. And we can see that what's happened here is now that I've logged onto the machine, PowerShell has loaded up. Now, once again, if I try and load PowerShell, we can see down here, PowerShell, I can double click it all I want, nothing's happening. But I have the ability to turn around and run interactive commands, do whatever I choose to do, try to enumerate the rest of my environment, because I have circumvented the restrictions of a user, and I've got a process within the computer to execute PowerShell.exe. So there are multiple ways to be able to break out of a restricted desktop environment. Those are just a couple. Each method works because security controls often focus on blocking obvious things, preventing users from opening obvious executables, but they can sometimes forget alternative paths that people may take to try and get to functionality that they want to. We'll explore some other ways of breaking out in future, but there's just 3 for you to think of if you find yourself on a restricted desktop or conducting a breakout test anytime soon. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found it useful.